Okay, and we are live. All right. So, hello everyone, and welcome to Nerd Church, the show where Katie and Aldo explore the Bible by reading through the Catholic lectionary and seeing what the critical scholarship has to say about the passages. We also are trying, the other thing that we're doing is trying to model for scholars and interested outside observers kind of how Catholics and the Catholic Church read the Bible and negotiate with the Bible and encounter the Bible through the lectionary. Along those lines, I am Katie. I have a degree in religious studies and most of a degree in American history. And I've also spent a lot of time on my own studying the history of the early church, as well as the development of Catholic thought in the Middle Ages and into the modern period. I am also a lector at my Catholic church, which means that some of the passages I'm reading are ones that I've read earlier today in a liturgical context. And Aldo is
Well, I'm an industrial designer by trade, and then I became, through different circumstances, I turned into dubbing material from English into Spanish. I love the Bible since I was like 12, and I started learning Hebrew and Aramaic, and that's my forte to say it in some way. So I try to give insights into the Hebrew Bible, the Second Temple literature, and even the rabbinic literature, which has some interesting parallels in the New Testament.
okay. And without further ado, we are going to get started. And we are, as we have mentioned before, in year A of the 3-year lectionary cycle. However, one thing that you will notice today is that the gospel is that we're so after having so you'll notice that after the Christmas holiday where we spent some time with Luke and some time with John as well, now we are back to our regularly scheduled Matthew. As we start with, this is December 28th, which is the Holy Family of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. And um, One thing that I always find entertaining is that in the Catholic Church, there's sometimes a pressure put on people to have large families, but
Mhm.
the family that's held up as kind of the model of how a family is supposed to relate to each other is mom, dad, and one kid. And I've never been quite sure what to do with that disconnect, but it's kind of an interesting disconnect. Um, so um, our so I'll without further ado, I'll just get started with the readings unless there was anything you wanted to say first, Aldo.
No, please go on.
Okay, so our first reading is from the book of Sirach. Specifically, we're looking at Sirach chapter 3, verse 2 through 6, and then verses 12 through 14. So, God set a father in honor over his children. A mother's authority he confirms over her sons. Whoever honors his father atones for sins and preserves himself from them. When he prays, he is heard. He stores up riches who reveres his mother. Whoever honors his father is gladdened by children, and when he prays, is heard. Whoever reveres his father will live a long life. He who obeys his father brings comfort to his mother. My son, take care of your father when he is old. Grieve him not as long as he lives. Even if his mind fail, be considerate of him. Revile him not all the days of his life. Kindness to a father will not be forgotten. Firmly planted against the debt of your sins, a house raised in justice to you. And then the psalm is Psalm 28, verses 1 through 5. Blessed are those who fear the Lord and walk in his ways. Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. For you shall eat the fruit of your handiwork. Blessed shall you be and favored. Your wife shall be like a fruitful vine in the recesses of your home, your children like olive plants around your table. Behold, thus the man is blessed who fears the Lord. The Lord bless you from Zion. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. And then we have a reading from the letter of St. Paul, which we'll put an asterisk by Paul there and talk about that in a minute. But this is Colossians chapter 3, verse 12 through 21. Brothers and sisters, put on as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, heartfelt compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another and forgiving one another. If one has a grievance against one another, as the Lord has forgiven you, so must you also do. And over all these put on love, that is the bond of perfection, and let the peace of Christ control your hearts, and the peace into which you are also called in one body, and be thankful. And let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, as in all wisdom you teach and admonish one another, singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs with gratitude in your hearts to God. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, and give thanks to God the Father through him. Wives, be subordinate to your husbands as is proper to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and avoid any bitterness toward them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this is pleasing to the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, so they do not become discouraged. And then the gospel according to Matthew is Matthew chapter 2, verse 13 through 15, and then Matthew 19 through 23. When the Magi had departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay here until I tell you. Herod is going to search for the child and destroy him. Joseph rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt. He stayed there until the death of Herod, that what the Lord had said through the prophets might be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son. When Herod died, and behold, the angel of the Lord reappeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, Rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. He rose, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in the place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go back there. And because he had been warned in a dream, he departed to the region of Galilee. He went and dwelt in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. Okay, so that is the end of the writing for today. I have some thoughts and feelings about the epistle and the gospel that we'll get into in a moment, but we should start with Sirach, which is just kind of, I think, giving us a good start on this theme of just kind of what does an ideal family look like? What does a family look like when everybody is doing what they're supposed to be doing in the family?
Right. So, just to give you a little background about the Book of Sirach, this is a book which is not considered canonical in the Jewish scriptures, but it is interesting to notice that in rabbinic literature it is quoted a number of times. So the book was preserved in Hebrew. It is not preserved in the Masoretic text, the official text which is used by the Jewish communities today. But there are some manuscripts found in what is called the Cairo Geniza, which was a repository of books which were destined to be discarded. And we have some very lengthy sections about the book of Ben Sirach or Sirach. There are also some fragments in Masada in Israel near the Dead Sea, and of course in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But mostly we know this version from the Septuagint. So as Katie said, this part of the book tries to show us what the ideal family should look like. And if you were to read the Hebrew, it is very interesting because this book sounds very much like Proverbs or even Deuteronomy. And it is trying to mimic the same language that appears in Exodus 20:12, honor thy father and thy mother. And that is the idea. So the author of this book is trying to, let's say, to interpret or to expand on this idea of one of these commandments, which were given at Mount Sinai. And so
So
we
what
can,
I'm sorry to interrupt. No, you were mentioning sort of the Sirach is kind of one of those books that almost made it into the canon of the Hebrew Bible.
correct.
Can you expand on that a little bit more? Kind of when is this composed? Do we know maybe who wrote it? What do we know about that?
Sure. So the book was written around 200 BC. So this precedes some 200 years the birth of Christ. And it is an interesting book because even though it is preserved in Greek, it's still very Jewish in flavor. So it is merely a translation, and even though the Greek expands on the Hebrew, as I said, it is a book which still preserves this ancient biblical Hebrew tradition instead of the more Hellenistic style of writing that some of the Apocrypha or other books do it. I can't remember exactly why the rabbis argue that this book should not be included in the Bible, but perhaps they perceive it as a very late book and not, it is, it comes from a priestly circle. It comes, so that may be one of the reasons as to why the rabbis did not preserve it, because they would have preferred to have a book which was at least attributed in part to a biblical character. So the person who wrote this book, Ben Sira, was from a priestly family in Jerusalem in the 200s BC, and that puts him in, around the time of the Maccabees. But what he does is he tries to instruct the people according to an interpretation of the Torah and its values.
So in a way, this is almost more of a commentary on and an expansion on Exodus than it is sort of its own independent thing.
That's correct. It expands on many aspects of this section, of course, expands on Exodus, but there are other sections which, try to praise the prophets, to praise the kings of Israel and the like. So it is like an overview from the Hellenistic period on how people on how the priestly circles interpreted scripture, and this book is pretty Pharisaic, so perhaps we do not have as much evidence to say this is a Sadducee book, but if it comes from from a priestly background, it would be closer to this Sadducee group.
Okay. Very cool. Okay.
Then,
Did you have anything to say about the psalm?
well, it's there's not much to say,
Yeah,
at least on my behalf.
yeah, once again, I feel like the psalm is just kind of in there for flavor.
Exactly, but it's the same idea. It echoes this idea of having a blessed, a fruitful family. You're being rewarded if you are a person who walks in the ways of the Lord, and that's pretty much the gist of it.
Yeah. And of course, we have the same kind of things going on in Colossians. Now,
Correct.
Colossians um, is another one of those books that is not um, that most that there are still some scholars that want to argue that Colossians is maybe an expansion of something that Paul wrote or whatever. There's also,
Mhm.
though, a really good argument to be made that, again, Colossians is something that was composed probably in the late second century, mid to late second century, probably by a follower of Paul. Um, and one of the clues of that is actually um, the let is the later section of Colossians, the wives submit to your husband's part. Because as you can see there, that's very much at odds with a lot of what Paul's talking about in some of the letters that are um, generally considered to be genuine. Um, I should mention another reason for um, thinking that Paul didn't write Colossians is that this doesn't occur in our earliest editions of in our earliest manuscripts that collect the writings of Paul. In addition, this section of Colossians where it's talking about basically structuring the Christian family along the lines of the ideal Roman family. So you have the head of the family, the paterfamilias, who is supposed to deal with his family justly, and then they in turn are supposed to obey him, which is which is not something that you find so much in the Gospels or even in what are the accepted as the genuine letters of Paul. And the argument is essentially that this is part of the kind of this is the early Christian community trying to be respectable and non-threatening and good in this sort of second, third century Roman context. And I say third century because um, the earliest collections of the earliest manuscript collections of Colossians don't include anything after verse 17. So 18 through 21 are completely absent. And I think that even reading it in English translation, there's kind of this at the beginning of the verse, this very kind of generalized description of how the Christian community is supposed to be relating to each other. And, it's all sort of everybody's treating each other on a level of equality. And, it's everybody's supposed to be treating each other well, right?
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden, it's like, boom, wives submit to your husbands. And the thought just doesn't even follow one to the other. It seems like a very clumsy join within the text. Um, you know, on the other hand, you can't exactly, when you're reading this in the Catholic context, you can't just say, well, Paul doesn't write it, so we're just going to ignore Colossians. Although I will note that the shorter the lectionary actually gives the option of starting of stopping with the end of verse 17, so that it would end with, whatever you do in word or in deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Boom, done. And I admit, when I had to read this today in church, I was like, the elector, they said. It'll be fun, they said. Do I have to read wives submit to your husbands? Because that's some bullshit right there. And so I was like, are we doing the shorter reading or the longer reading? And the deacon was like, it's the longer reading. And I was like, God. So when I read it, and I'm just going to read, because the text of this has the reading. I don't know if you can quite read this, but it has the reading and then it has notes on the side that are meant to advise, that are essentially stage directions. And the stage direction for this one, for 18 through 21, is: this challenging final section includes something to trouble almost everyone in the assembly. Yeah, you don't say. Because you will not have the opportunity to explore its theology, a neutral tone will be helpful here. Paul names specific family roles, but these instructions are also for believers in general. And and that, honestly, that little paragraph there, and that acknowledgement of, yes, this is difficult and this is complicated, because that then I got a very nice homily where the priest was like, yeah, these are all general instructions for everybody, and this is talking about healthy family relationships where no one is where and he really put a whole bunch of emphasis on the husbands love your wives, parents avoid troubling your children parts, which, I mean, yes, absolutely. One thing that needs to be said and needs to be acknowledged is, wives submit to your husbands has been used to justify abuse and mistreatment and all kinds of really, really horrible things being done to women. That is just a fact of life. And I think that we also, though, rather than letting everybody else off the hook and just calling Paul a son of a bitch and throwing the book across the room, is to say that part of that is the way that this verse has been applied. Because I don't know because very often when people are trying to victim blame victims of abuse, whether it's a child or whether it's an adult woman, the kid gets asked, well, were you disobeying your parents? Or the woman gets asked, well, were you being submissive enough? Right? We as Christians, and just kind of as, just generally as humans, are less good at saying, when there's problems in a relationship, you know, men aren't necessarily asked, are you loving your wife?
Mhm.
Are you provoking your children? Are you treating your partner with bitterness? And I think that reading it that way, and asking those really hard questions, not just the hard questions about the text, but also the hard questions about how are people applying this text, um, is something that I think is really important to do. And now I've had my feminist rant, which I think is needed sometimes. uh, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say.
Yeah, well, I think that this is a good moment to perhaps introduce this idea of negotiation in the sense that
Yes.
we do not have to agree, 100% with each and every word that comes from the Bible. We must remember that these texts were produced in a specific society during a specific time and region. And of course, these texts are really ancient. They are very old, and they preserve some very ancient traditions. And of course, times change, people change, and some of this may still be useful, but some others may not. So I think it's fair to say that we have to negotiate with the text and really, evaluate it and see what's still relevant for us and what's still not. And the text in itself isn't good or bad, but as you mentioned in a part of your explanation, it is people abusing this kind of texts to to wield power over others, which is something which should not be done, whether you're condemning someone else going to hell or denying for them salvation or whatever. So we really have to, to get involved with the text, wrestle with the text, and try to understand where it comes from and what we want to do with it.
Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the things that to me is kind of interesting with the lectionary, is just looking at the way that, in a way, the lectionary itself is a renegotiation with the text, right?
Right.
Because essentially it's pulling out the parts that are interesting and are worth highlighting. Because, for example, just to go back to Colossians, it stops with 21,
Mhm.
because 23 or 22 and 23 are slaves obey your masters, right?
Mhm.
Well, that is and of course at the time that um whoever wrote this using Paul's name wrote this, slaves were part of the family, they were part of the household. So if you're talking about the way a household should be run, you're talking about not just blood family, but you're talking about slaves and servants and various relatives,
Right.
and so this is kind of drawing the line under husbands, wives, parents, and children, and saying, okay, we're talking about this as the family, right? Which is kind of interesting. And in the same way, when we get to the Gospel of Matthew, um, we skip from verse 15 to verse 19, which is, of course, leaving out the massacre of the innocents, um, which is, of course, stuff that never happened.
Mhm.
um, because because the massacre of the innocents is one of the projects that Matthew has in the Gospel of Matthew is sort of drawing these parallels between Moses and Jesus.
Right.
So Moses had to go into hiding because he was going to be killed in Exodus. So therefore, Jesus has to go into hiding so he can be killed, but so that he won't be killed in Matthew. And so he cooks up this. So the author of Matthew cooks up this massacre of the innocents, which is not something that Herod did historically. Um, Herod the Great, you know, was not a nice person, but he did not order a mass slaughter of all male children, because that's the kind of thing that would actually make it into the history books.
Mhm.
And since it's not referred to in any of the other gospels, and it's not referred to in um, Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, um, it didn't it basically is an ahistorical piece, and I'm sure that that's what's behind this decision to leave it out. um you
Mhm.
know that said, it is worth pointing out that Herod um did kill a whole bunch of his relatives, right? So that's probably why the idea that you could stick in this story of, oh yeah, and he was totally going to kill Jesus, got
Mhm.
put in there because it's kind of one of those things where it's not it's not true in terms of historical fact, but as very often happens when you have an oral history, it's saying something about Herod that is true, right?
Right.
Which is that Herod was obsessed with maintaining his own power and was willing to kill anyone who got in his way. Um, and again, as we talked about, Matthew is also really into creating parallels between Joseph, Jesus's father, and Old Testament Joseph.
Mhm.
So Joseph is doing everything that he is because the angels keep visiting him in dreams.
Mhm.
And then of course there's the whole flight into Egypt, and then the family moves to Nazareth, which the majority of critical scholars will argue that the flight into Egypt is in there purely for literary reasons. That it's, essentially to get this parallel between Jesus and Moses building up even more. Although there are some people who especially as they're looking, as the argument is growing that Christianity is essentially an outgrowth of this very Greek, very Hellenized Judaism, which was actually centered in Alexandria, that it's either that one of the other things that this move is doing is kind of signaling to the sort of Jewish communities living outside of the Holy Land, as well as to these, kind of these sort of proto-Christian God-fearers that are hanging around the synagogues, that Jesus is kind of maybe been exposed to this larger cosmopolitan world, at least a little bit when he was a little kid. So it's kind of, and this is one of the things that's really interesting about Matthew, is that on the one hand, he's very Jewish, but on the other hand, he's also very concerned with connecting Jesus to all of these sort of different sub movements that are going on in first century Judaism.
Mhm.
Where, whether that's the John the Baptist movement, or whether that's the Pharisees, or whether that's even this larger sort of Greco-Jewish world. Because of course, Alexandria was the great hub of learning and study in the Mediterranean world, and particularly for a chunk of the Jewish community. Which is why actually this is an area where I personally am willing to go historical maximalist and say maybe they did move to Egypt for a while, because it would also make sense to me that part of the reason why people were willing to argue for Jesus being the Messiah is that he had, if you negotiated with the texts in the right way, that he had the right biography, right? That he had actually spent some time in Egypt, that, maybe he was actually born in Bethlehem, and then the family moves to Egypt, and then they move to Nazareth. That to me, to me, it would make sense that this could be recording some kind of a historical memory. But I don't know. What do you think about that, Aldo? I've been going on about my crazy for long enough.
Oh, no worries. It was excellent. I really liked the comparison you made with Joseph, the father of Jesus, with Joseph from the tribes of Israel. And perhaps people will remember the episode we did on the nativity readings. So it was interesting to notice that in Matthew, Joseph receives messages from the angel of the Lord in dreams, in a dream. And on the other hand, in the Gospel of Luke, it is an angel appears to shepherds and appears, let's say, perhaps even physically. So I think this tells us about the different aims which the different authors of the Gospels had in mind. As you explained, for the Gospel of Matthew, they are trying to depict Joseph as the Joseph from the Old Testament who was a master of dreams. So that is why he receives these messages from the angel of the Lord through dreams, and especially because he's receiving the message privately, not openly. Perhaps even in a sense, they are trying to tell us that the reason is they don't want Herod to notice, the whereabouts of the child. And on the other hand, Luke is making use of these public appearances of an angel or angels in a sense that he's showing how God intervenes in history directly, openly, so that everybody can see these miracles developing in real time for, for all people equally.
Exactly. And I also just think it's interesting how much Matthew is kind of focusing on Joseph,
Mhm.
whereas Luke is a lot more about Mary, and it kind of I think is an interesting way to kind of look at the relationship. But last week we were kind of very much looking at the relationship between Matthew and Luke, which of course kind of get mushed together to create
Mhm.
um, the sort of picture that if you ask somebody to tell you the Christmas story, they're going to be kind of jumping back and forth between Matthew and Luke and not even aware that they're doing it. And one thing that I really enjoyed the other day when we went through it is they kind of each gospel kind of gets its due and are kind of allowed to breathe on their
Yeah.
own. Um, so it's kind of a short one today, but that was all I really had to talk about.
Mhm. I have just one more note regarding the last part of the gospel reading. So it says, he went and dwelt in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. Now, if you get a Bible with some commentary on it, you may notice that that last part, the verse which is quoted as he shall be called a Nazarene, there is no actual verse which contains that. So it is not a quotation from the Hebrew Bible, and there's some speculation as to why that is. It is a fact that perhaps people who have dealt with rabbinic literature, there's a phenomenon where you may see some rabbis quoting passages from scripture from what is called the Old Testament,
Mm-hmm.
where there are either verses which do not exist in our current version of the Hebrew Bible, or there are some interesting variants. And this one seems to be a similar case. So perhaps there was at some point in some tradition um, this verse which reads, "He shall be called a Nazarene," or perhaps this is just an interpretation, an oral tradition which stems from a circle of prophets.
Is there any is there any suggestion about what that might be a paraphrase of then?
Well, some link it to the word netzer, which is like a shoot from a plant. When you cut a plant and then a new kind of shoot comes out, that is what the word netzer means. But the problem is that most people refer that word netzer to sound like Nazarene. Now I'm getting into the weeds right here, right now.
Please, the weeds is where we live.
But the problem is that you will see in the Greek texts there is a kind of a convention, a spelling convention on how to transliterate, how to reproduce the Hebrew phonetic system into Greek letters.
Uh,
And Nazarene is always written with, sorry, let me go back a little. So one of the words to which this Nazarene may be related is to Netzer, just the way we mentioned. And then there's the other one, Nezer, which is with a Z. And that one is for the Nazirite vow, where the person would not cut his or her hair for 30 days, and they would abstain from wine or anything derived from the vine, from grapes. You could not eat raisins, you could not eat raisin peels, you could not eat seeds or even grapes, grape juice, whatever.
Yeah, and there's a suggestion that John the Baptist was a Nazarite, correct?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So then going back, sorry, were you
Yes,
about to say
so
something?
so so there's also an argument that Jesus may have been a Nazarite at least at some point in his life.
And that's what some people say, but I think there's a passage in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus drinks wine.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that
yeah. I
may,
mean, Jesus is drinking wine all over the place. So,
so that is a perhaps the text does not perhaps the text was modified in some sense. Perhaps there was an idea or there was a a memory of Jesus being a Nazarite, and perhaps these other texts were added where he drinks wine, and people didn't really understand the implications of having him drinking wine, and thus contradicting this idea of him being a Nazarite.
yeah. On the other hand, I believe that there were people who would that being a Nazarite was not necessarily a lifetime vow either.
No, there is they could be Nazirites for 30 days, and there's even some interesting stories in Jewish literature about people who were Nazirites for 7, 14, 21 years.
Yeah. So I mean, if we're playing the apologetics game, there's not necessarily a contradiction between somebody um, taking a Nazarite vow and
Mhm.
then fulfilling the terms of that vow and going back to drinking wine, etc., cutting their hair later on.
Right, it was an on and off thing. So you
Yeah.
would be able, to take it for 7 years and perhaps just rest a month and then start, uh, you know, 2 months, and then you have a rest, and then you would be a Nazarite for 14 years all over again. It
Yeah.
wasn't, mandatory.
Yeah. On the other hand, it's just as likely that this is put in there to just kind of be like, see, it says the Messiah has to be from Nazareth also.
Mhm.
So the fact that he grew up in this, little village in the back end of nowhere isn't a problem. Really, it's not a problem.
Mhm. Exactly.
Yeah.
And let's see. Hmm. Okay, so going back to the spelling convention I was telling you. So, in short, it could not be related to Nazareth because, or I'm sorry, Nazarene could not be related to Netzer, the word for this shoot,
Mm-hmm.
because then it would have to be spelled with an S
Mm-hmm.
or a TS or a TZ, which are different sounds in the Hebrew alphabet. But unfortunately, I have no other way to explain it. Um, I cannot come with a better solution, so that is the best explanation we have with the evidence at hand.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll figure it out at some point as we
Really?
work through all this.
Yeah.
Okay, so unless anybody has anything else, I think that we can close for today.
Mhm.
We will be back on January 1st to discuss the readings for the Feast of Mary, Mother of God.
Mhm.
And we will also take some time to discuss the development of the doctrine of the Theotokos and also talk about why it's the Feast of Mary, Mother of God, and not the Feast of the Circumcision. So we'll be back. Um, in a few days for all that and look forward to seeing you then. And everybody just have a wonderful day. And once